Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about a video from Prager University titled, Why Did America Fight the Korean War? Now with a runtime of just under 5 minutes, it is pretty impressive how effectively they managed to completely distort history to fit their right-wing agenda. So I'll say you simply cannot get quality education like that anywhere else. Good for PragerU. Now I know PragerU is pretty low-hanging fruit, and this is an older video of theirs, but with nearly 2 million views and a bunch of comments from both Americans and Koreans really buying into this stuff, I really just couldn't let it go unanswered. Now before I get going, you should go ahead and watch their video if you want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting the things they have said, so do that if you would like to. Alrighty, so now that you've done that, there are two major things about this video that I want to discuss. The first is the idea that the Korean War was a war fought by the United States for democracy and freedom. The second is a range of issues I have with the broader narrative being pushed here, that being that this was simply a Cold War conflict where communists were trying to attack the unassuming capitalist world, and generally just trying to make sure that the version of the Korean War we hear all fits neatly into the Cold War story we all know and love. So let's deal with these two big issues one by one. The first one being, did the United States fight in the Korean War for democracy? Let's hear what PragerU had to say about that.
For over the next 60 years, a Cold War persisted between the Stalinist North and what by the 1980s had evolved into the democratic economic powerhouse of South Korea. But a victory nonetheless, and not just from a military perspective, but from a moral one as well. The reason 35,000 Americans died in Korea was to keep at least half the Korean people free. Korea did not have a single material resource that would have benefited America.
Alrighty, the reason 35,000 Americans died in Korea was to keep at least half the Korean people free. Well, we can deal with this one pretty quickly, can't we? That is not true. The US pretty plainly did not keep South Korea free. In fact, it actively helped it run an authoritarian dictatorship. From 1945 all the way through to the 1980s, the United States was the chief ally and financier of a brutal regime in South Korea that actively murdered and suppressed its citizens and undermined any attempt at establishing a democratic system. The government killed and imprisoned anyone they could manage to pin the label communist onto, which effectively meant anyone who did not like the government at the time. And it saw the Yi administration do truly awful things. The Jeju Uprising and Massacre, the Mungyong Massacre, and the Bodo League Massacre all took place at this time, so feel free to have a look at those as a starting point to get an idea. But it didn't end there. After Yi, the military coup that took Park Chung-hee to power oversaw a period of rampant abuse by the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. It also saw South Korea become known as the tear gas nation, and during this time the government banned elections, it engaged in widespread arbitrary detention and torture under the Yushin Constitution. It did lots of awful things, all backed by the United States. This was then followed by the 1979 YH incident and the following labor riots, as well as the Gwangju massacre of 1980 just after Park was assassinated. All this and more, while on the US bankroll and receiving enormous support from the US government. How's that for freedom? Now, you will notice in getting through all of those many awful things that I just covered, I can get through quite a lot before I have to actually run up against the subtle wording that PragerU is using, which is,
For over the next 60 years, a Cold War persisted between the Stalinist North and what by the 1980s had evolved into the democratic economic powerhouse of South Korea.
The Stalinist North and what by the 80s had evolved into the democratic powerhouse of South Korea. Gosh, they might have skipped over a few decades there, hey? Crazy how they missed all that awful stuff that happened up until the 1980s. Sure, that was an accident. This is all essentially to say that the idea that PragerU is trying to put out here, that the United States fought in the Korean War for South Korean freedom because the country engaged in the beginnings of a democratic transition over 3 decades after their intervention in that conflict, and after years of brutal authoritarian rule, is laughable. But PragerU tries to gloss over that with some very deceptively worded language to try and get off on a technicality. It is not true. That is not what happened, and that is not why the United States intervened in the Korean War. Okay, so moving on to the broader issues I have with the narrative of the Korean War as simply another Cold War conflict. Let's look at how PragerU tries to frame the Korean War in its broader context.
A stark confrontation between the forces of democracy and communism began on June 25, 1950, when Soviet-backed communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded its U.S.-backed anti-communist South Korean neighbor. Soviets, buoyed by their own recent development of an atomic bomb and Mao Zedong's communist victory in China, sensed America's lack of resolve and encouraged the North's aggression.
Now, this attempts to reduce the conflict to nothing but a proxy war as part of the Cold War, and it ignores the very complex issues going on in Korea at the time, and it will take some explaining to show why this is incorrect. PragerU vastly overstates the role of outside powers in the conflict, namely China and the USSR, and downplays American involvement drastically in the South, exclusively to the benefit of the United States in the narrative, while also simultaneously ignoring the deep complexity of Korean politics at the time. So, again, two main issues here. Let's deal with them one by one. The first is the role of China and the USSR in North Korea and the start of the Korean War, and the other being the role of the United States in the Republic of Korea. The first thing here I want to do away with is the statement that the Soviets and the Chinese encouraged the North's aggression. Now, the current scholarship is still contingent on archives slowly being opened and access to new sources, but the reality of the situation is very different to how they paint it, where the communists are simply just super keen to invade the unassuming South. And by that logic, of course, containment by the US was a great idea. Gotta stop those dastardly communists wherever they may go, right? Now, while it is absolutely true and cannot be denied that the North did invade the South, Kim Il-sung was very much the tail that wagged the Soviet dog, not the reverse. Stalin's reluctant endorsement of the invasion in 1950 was very much just that. It was reluctant. Stalin's acquiescence also had very little to do with China's support for North Korea. Most of China's support for the North Koreans consisted of sending back many troops who had fought in China against the Japanese. While Chinese support increased drastically when the UN troops got close to the Yalu River, the idea that the Chinese communists were the ones pushing the North Koreans into South Korea is ridiculous. It was the other way around, and communists in North Korea knew that they could rely on China as partners they had been working with for many years. After the 1950 endorsement by Stalin, the USSR did assist with some planning and logistics, but the idea that the North Koreans were somehow pushed into this conflict by the USSR and China as part of this grand move south to invade democratic countries by the communist bloc, it's just not true. Kim Il-sung was very keen for an invasion of the South, but equally, Sung Man-yi in the South was also very keen to invade the North. It's important to remember that the civil conflict and skirmishes across the peninsula had been going on for months at this point, and the situation was one in which, by 1950, it was essentially a conflict that was destined to happen. It has to be emphasized that this was a Korean conflict with international backers, not an international conflict simply fought by Koreans. The narrative being pushed by PragerU here ignores the fact that there were varied and complicated Korean factors at play, most notably being the country was in the midst of an enormous debate about how to run an independent Korean nation after decades of Japanese imperialism and the experience of World War II. Now, this leads us very nicely into the second issue, the role of the United States in South Korea prior to the war. When the US arrived in Korea, it completely misunderstood what was going on in Korean politics. The US systematically tried to break up the Korean People's Republic, which had been set up in Seoul in 1945. Lieutenant General John Hodge, who was the commander of the US occupation, put it pretty succinctly. He said, quote, "Flatly stated, one of our missions was to break down this communist government outside of any directives and without benefit of backing by the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the State Department." Now, the US had effectively put the Korean People's Republic into a nice Cold War narrative where it was a Soviet transplant that had been put there, not a Korean homegrown movement. But this Korean People's Republic was completely independent of China or the USSR and was very much a response to the situation on the ground. Now, why was that? Well, let's try and put things in perspective. And again, an American account of the time puts it pretty succinctly. Quote, "The leadership of the right wing is provided by that numerically small class which virtually monopolizes the native wealth and education of the country. Since this class could not have acquired and maintained its favored position under Japanese rule without a certain minimum of collaboration, it has experienced difficulty in finding candidates for political office and has been forced to support imported expatriate politicians such as Lee Sung-man and Kim Koo. These, while they have no pro-Japanese taint, are essentially demagogues bent on autocratic rule." The elite of Korean society had made themselves wealthy while everyone else suffered, and it was some of the most fertile ground possible for authentic Korean homegrown leftism. But the United States couldn't support that, and it chose to support right-wing candidates who had managed to improve their livelihoods at the expense of everyone else during the Japanese colonial period. The US did not intervene in Korea to allow for the liberation of the Korean people or to engage in the democratic expression of their wants and needs. The United States was running a full military government in Korea from 1945 till 1948 and spent that time handpicking and selecting the incredibly unpopular elites of South Korea who had made their lives better at the expense of everyone else during the Japanese colonial period, and picked those people as the ones they would rather be doing business with and the ones who they thought would be amenable to US interests in the country. Indeed, about 85% of the Koreans who had served in the Japanese police force in Korea were now made part of the new US-created police force, and the US administration in Korea ran into enormous opposition from Koreans on their inability to engage with and repair the Japanese colonial legacy. So was this just a simple war between communism and capitalism? And was this just another Cold War conflict? Well, no. The United States completely misunderstood Korean politics upon its arrival, and the Japanese-Korean colonial relationship and how it would impact it. As a result, they condemned all people who were opposed to the running of the country by those who'd been associated with the Japanese colonial administration as leftists, and it all got swept up and packaged into a dumb, Cold War containment narrative that was useful for US interests at the time. So, by way of conclusion, why does PragerU make videos that give such a ridiculous account of the Korean War? Well, I think it's useful to recognize that it's not just in this video. They bring up the Korean War a bunch in their video about the Vietnam War. The phrase, as with Korea, is used a bunch of times in an attempt to say that the Vietnam War was fought for the same reasons, nothing but the defense of freedom in Asia, and that there were no other reasons the United States would get involved. This, as I hope I've shown, is not true, and it exists to serve a ridiculous narrative that the United States gets involved in conflicts overseas for no material gain or imperial ambitions, but simply to defend freedom and liberty for other people. Having a better understanding of the Korean War and the reasons it was fought are important not just for understanding this conflict, but for also understanding how broader narratives about the Cold War or the role of the US in the world more generally can be easily distorted by videos from far-right pretend universities who want to lie about how the world works. And while it always takes much longer to debunk this garbage than it does to pretend it all fits into a cohesive 5-minute video, the truth is always much more complicated than PragerU wants to pretend it is. Thanks for watching. I've given an account of Korean history that is none too kind on the role of the United States, but this is all with the major caveat that none of what I have said is to be interpreted as an excuse for any of the widespread human rights abuses that go on in North Korea, and any attempt to pretend that the DPRK is not an awful place should not be taken seriously. My spicy take for the day is that two things can be bad at the same time.